Okay, this recording is about criticizing and commenting on the kind of intellectualism that Piers Morgan is involved with. So, I mean, if I just take it issue by issue, I agree with some of the opinions and some of the bravery and the courage that Piers Morgan has showed in confronting certain things, even when they weren't universally, essentially for having the courage to traverse controversial issues and topics. What I don't like about Piers Morgan is that he has this very specious way of dealing with matters, where, and this comes through very clearly in the UnHerd interview with, I believe the presenter is Stephen, I'm not sure his surname, but and they were talking about the COVID-19 response. And I mean, and I think that that's a very good example of what I don't like about Piers Morgan, is that he doesn't replicate the case being made on the other side. He doesn't, he pretends not to understand it. He doesn't, um, he reiterates it. He reframes it too radically in a way that is literally intellectually dishonest. So when an alternative case is made against him, he literally dishonestly characterizes that case. He radically reinterprets it, and this is actually a journalistic sort of trick where you can kind of technically perform some kind of sort of fallacy of equivocation where you're either using the word, you're using a different definition of the same word, or you're kind of, I mean, he doesn't do that here. He does another sort of variant of the same thing. I'm just trying to explain the kind of gist of it. But where you either by hook or by crook, you find a way to kind of, it's like how lawyers color their words when they ask questions. And how they interpret the answer. It's that kind of, very uncharitable. But and when I say uncharitable, I mean that it's dishonest. That in some sense, language is always going to be somewhat precise. And if you're going to radically recontextualize things that are said, you're not communicating. What you're doing is a kind of sophistry, and you can see that sophistry being um, deployed quite brazenly in this particular interview. Um, I'm slightly angered that the interviewer didn't um, go after Pierce, because I guess Pierce is also more used to being the interviewer himself, where he can kind of chair the discussion. And I mean, I've got things in my mind where he's had people on the show almost where he's had this narrative pre-scripted, and he's had this kind of an exchange sort of anticipated, and he's just kind of um, tried to arrive at the conclusion so badly that the process is uh, it's really disgusting how the substance is abused. There's this controversial European, I think he's from a European parliamentary member. Um, oh, this is embarrassing. He's from an Eastern European country, um, and he was on the show, and Piers Morgan was trying to grill him for his sexism. And apart from the slight sort of language barrier, um, this man was frankly not sexist. And he did not fall within the current dogma and the current orthodoxy around identity politics, which Piers Morgan is quite happy to sort of white knight, when it's just sort of talking about the gender pay gap and other sort of trumped up, um, somewhat imagined monsters and sort of statistical lies and statistics leverage to kind of create this narrative, and then here's Pierce trying to kind of and this person essentially he didn't fit the target that was being painted on him, and merely by cutting up the substance of what he had to say in order to fit into the prescribed formula that Pierce had already sort of agreed or sort of set his sight on the outcome. He'd sort of agreed with himself as to what the case against him is relative to his case, and it comes off as disingenuous. It comes off as it's somewhat ironic because he's I don't want to get deep into sort of character assassination and talking about personality, but I have the same, let's say, low opinion of Joe Rogan to some degree, because I mean, Joe Rogan has been led to developing better opinions on certain subjects. He was not an early adopter. He was kind of, and some people are like this, that they're almost good readings of where the collective consciousness is. They're somewhat like an aggregated, sort of median. They somewhat represent the median experience of people who are roughly engaged with issues and topics, and are sort of part of this cultural experience. And so they're good thermometers of almost representing where sort of Joe Blogs is on these issues. Or I mean, obviously these people aren't exactly representatives of the median inhabitant of a culture or a society. They are slightly ahead of the curb because they are oh sorry ahead of the curve because they are you know uh, uh, you know they have been lifted to prominence, and they use that prominence to kind of scan the horizon and to kind of meet, be one of the, obviously they won't interview someone from nothing. They won't interview someone who's a no one, but, after other people have made some noise about it, they're scanning the horizon and they are looking to engage with things that look like that they might be uh, significant in the culture, imminently perhaps. And so they're like half a step ahead, and that means that they make themselves slightly vulnerable because they can't just kind of and they do somewhat try to represent uh, a kind of a consensus on some level, or I mean, which means that these sorts of people are important because how they defend their own understanding, or how they describe their own understanding is a a very important reflection of the kind of the zeitgeist to some degree, and the kind of and it can be very important to see the themes that underpin the current zeitgeist and what's holding its development back. But um, as far as individuals go, as far as being a sovereign individual, having a kind of a responsible sense of agency, um, you know, I, I see this um, as a failing on some level, um, especially when I see it represented conspicuously, as in terms of their reticence to deal with something because it doesn't fall into the narrative that they have adopted. And when I see them defending that narrative in what I would consider an intellectually dishonest or clumsy, or this isn't clumsy in some sense because it's at least I'm not talking about Joe Rogan at the moment. Let me just go back to Pierce. That it's a concocted strategy, And uh, in some sense, it kind of it has a one-way filter. Like, I didn't hear you just say that, so I'm just going to reinterpret what you said, or I'm going to repeat your point for you in terms of, and then show my answer to it. So it's like, I'm not going to have a direct exchange. I'm not going to have a direct, um, negotiate. My beliefs are not going to be made vulnerable because you're not, because I'm not going to. And I mean, you can kind of see the image thinking that Piers Morgan uses. That he's kind of describing a sort of a sentiment, and that sentiment does not persist, does not keep its integrity in the face of a particular point of view that actually doesn't fall into the caricature, doesn't fall into the narrative that Pierce is trying to sort of read from. And so, he didn't actually answer the question. He ducked the question. He obfuscated. He very clearly obfuscated the substance of the opposing case made against him, by essentially making a blanket accusation and a sort of and a complaint against people who are being selfish or something like that. This kind of and so that kind of conspicuous false reduction is really what holds back um, a lot of issues from ever reaching a point of cultural solubility. Problems aren't solved because of this kind of um, sloppy thinking, for want of a better description. It's quite interesting as well that people, they they can't help but kind of engage in a kind of visceral um, sort of disgust. I mean, you can see this in the example when Pierce was talking to the European parliamentarian who was from some Eastern European country. Or was it Poland? Maybe it was Poland. Anyway, uh, or maybe it was Bulgaria. I'm not sure. But he had his accent. I think was either, maybe I think it was Bulgaria. Anyway, and it is interesting that, I mean, at least in what I'm pointing to now, there's a theme because he's sort of indulging excessively in or if you don't want to use indulging, then he's feigning a kind of decadent um, moral disgust, and he doesn't want to sort of drop that shtick, and therefore he can't actually contend with a substantive opposing case made against his position, because then his shtick wouldn't cover it. His shtick wouldn't be able to kind of um, generate a kind of a consistent emotional treatment of the issue. And so it's almost, it's clearly to him it's more important to have sort of consistent emotions than they are to have consistent thinking, and that's very clear in how he obfuscates the substance of what he is, inverted commas, debating. um, and I mean, this is not to say that, like, there isn't some logic to what he was saying, but it just wasn't pertinent to what was being brought up against him. There were certain sort of, in terms of what he was engaging with, there were huge gaps in his thinking, which is basically filled up by this kind of sentiment. by this emotionality. Um, I mean, I guess you could say. I mean, maybe he is more logical than what I'm and rational than what I'm making him out to be. Maybe he just didn't want to actually have to say those things, which he would have had to say in order to intellectually respond to the case being made for another way to deal with COVID-19, which is that um, essentially, if you let young people get the disease, then he doesn't believe that that will I don't want to put hypothetical words in his mouth, but I mean, essentially, this also, I mean, just getting into that issue, if you went specifically into that issue, I mean, it would just show the feebleness of his hope, because essentially, so I mean, if your conjecture basically is that if you yet let young people get the virus while you still counseled vulnerable people to self isolate, then essentially Pierce's point only makes sense if you basically say, well, if you allow more young people to get the virus, then that will also make the vulnerable people more vulnerable um, to it spreading to them. I would actually argue that that's not true. I would say that it's probably the opposite is true, because you will accelerate the time in which you actually precipitate herd immunity. And before then, um, right now, what's happening is that people probably can't keep to uh, achieving the 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 level of advice in terms of sort of maintaining social distancing, especially the young. And so, because they can't actually keep to the rigorous sort of strictness, and in some sense, I also think that, I mean, a lot of this is also informed by really strange sort of science, which is incoherent, which is that we have to realize how many people probably have already gotten this virus, which is much higher than we think it is, how much it has already spread through the population, um, which are things that are probably incredibly underreported, which you have to randomly test, areas, but also the problem is that many people will have natural forms of immunity which will stop them from even getting it. So there isn't just herd immunity from having it and then developing antibodies. There are also other forms of immunity which are also in the population, and we don't know to the extent to how what that component is. So and it's also the fact that you see, like, people have different rates of exposure to one another. Like, some people in society are like delivery drivers, or let's just say people that see the public face to face. And these people are, let's say, a kind of much more significant in terms of herd immunity. So you actually achieve herd immunity at a much lower total population rate than people conventionally believe, because there's a huge variability between individuals in terms of their exposure to one another. Some people are like, let's just say, pragmatically, or within their life, uh, um, within the conduct in their life, uh, uh, they're just much more uh, reclusive already. And so when you sort of factor that in, um, you realize that if you get the virus just spreading a bit, um, especially with this kind of virus, with the kind of R naught that it has, that you precipitate uh, um, quite significant forms of herd immunity very quickly if you actually allow it to spread to some degree, if you give it sort of some leeway. Um, and it's also likely that a lot of that, um, or perhaps even most of that work has already happened, even with all the restrictions. The problem is that sort of in slowing down the spread of the virus, it probably has actually been counterproductive. But those are things that people will probably only have the confidence to say in hindsight, when it is, I mean, historically, I think it's going to be undeniable that these responses would have been seen as wholly irresponsible and unwarranted. Um, and comparing countries' death rates and things like that is just, it doesn't make any sense, because you only know at the end. So essentially, all COVID viruses usually only last 2 seasons, 2 flu seasons, and then they're not a big thing anymore. So the question will be is, will we have to endure 3 flu seasons because of the lockdown that we went through? And if and or perhaps even so it's going to, the area under, so essentially saying that Sweden has had a much higher death rate, well, uh, that is something that you have to take into account. Well, how much of the population has it actually gotten through? And if it has gotten through less of the population in countries that have observed a lockdown, that's not a win in death rate. And you might even find that extending the course of the virus, which is also giving the virus more opportunity to mutate um, in certain populations, uh, that in the end you would have actually, in an absolute sense, created a higher mortality rate from the virus. So I mean, all the so-called benefits of it spreading more slowly is uh, can largely be seen as counterproductive. I mean, the only logic, the only rationale that the lockdown ever had was was to conserve medical supplies and resources, because it was unknown if um, hospitals were going to get overrun. Essentially, that is the only reason to do it. So, and then the only way to make sort of P.S. Morgan's story work is to kind of ratchet up this sort of contrived narrative, and sort of diminish, or to sort of overlook, like, well, why would that be a better outcome? Why would that be a better path to follow? Why, it sort of, he very carefully sort of obfuscated that by falsely reducing the case made against him. Um, it's I mean, I guess, I mean, to me, this is sort of what happens when people don't think from principles, you know, because they sort of, then they don't have a collection of values which they have to work out if those values are represented in the thoughts that they have, in the beliefs that they have, in the rationale that they extol. they don't have to sort of worry about conserving beliefs because they just have to kind of represent one of those beliefs. Conserving their values because they just have to represent one of those values sort of speciously at the expense of the other values, which they sort of leave out of their stick, which they leave out of their thinking conspicuously. And then they kind of have to compensate for that conspicuous lapse by creating a kind of moral panic or a kind of emotional hysteria over, some issue, which is what I see as Piers Morgan's shtick, essentially. And I'm just trying to I'm not trying to perform character assassination, but I'm just trying to specifically talk about this as an example because I think it's a very clear example. Just to round off the description of the obfuscation, so, I mean, yeah, I can understand how I can perhaps sound like a partisan in this because I think that there are so many other factors that are worthy to bring in as to refute the general position that Piers Morgan takes. And so when I go into those other things, instead of just completing the single thought, but so essentially the obfuscation and the diversion that Piers Morgan makes specifically is that he answers a question that wasn't asked so that he can go off on the tangent that young people are selfish. When, this is completely antithetical to how public health should be managed. People should know that essentially it's not possible to get 100% compliance with guidances and directions that are issued to the public, especially, sort of common sense would tell you that even if you got pretty good compliance, that 90% compliance that you manage, or 95% compliance, you're not going to get 100%. When you're directing young people to social distance for this kind of extended period of time, it's not. You can't expect, so sort of just trying to create a polemic around how selfish young people are instead of just, let's say, facing the facts and making a responsible plan that takes reality into account. That instead you're going to sort of just storm the moral high ground to make it a kind of a moral grandstand instead of actually dealing with reality. So that's. But I mean, also that this whole moral issue that he talks about young people being selfish is a red herring. It does not come into. It's not relevant to the case or the argument that was made by the interviewer. And so, Piers Morgan very clearly misdirects. He very clearly essentially addresses a straw man. Which and when people address straw men, it does somewhat provoke other people to then bring in ancillary points rather than going back to the original diversion from the actual engagement of actually having the substance being dealt with. So the substance gets sort of brushed under the rug. So that Piers Morgan can indulge in his, sort of his shtick, I guess. But again, so I see this as a symptom of a general. I mean, this is the problem of journalism, sort of in a microcosm. This is an example of the problems in journalism, is that it's sensationalist garbage in some sense. It does not care to responsibly address the substance, and so you get these very superficial takes, of matters of very high importance that are complicated and which do require, kind of getting the experts and getting the controversy that experts might have, sort of put under a microscope, which doesn't happen because people are pontificating sort of strange moral diversions, strange sort of hysterical sort of moral panic sort of polemics that are frankly distractions. Um, but I mean, yeah. So I mean, the other general points then, which you know, which sort of refute Pierce's Morgan's red herring and other things, is that this is not how public health is meant to work. That it's this kind of um, and it's very clear that this virus is nothing like the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu killed people indiscriminately. Uh, and it's also a red herring to say that some populations are more vulnerable than other populations, just like on average statistically, in terms of racial groups and things like that. So you're sort of making this it's always these very strange nebulous moral arguments that it's a sort of it's an unknown quantity, so that you can't actually deal with it, with any kind of perspective, with any kind of um, uh, you know that it's making this very sort of convoluted sort of hysterical reduction of reality, so that you can't actually take things into account with any sense of proportionality. That you just describe people as more vulnerable because they are a minority, and therefore it's like a sacred cow. That we can't have a different kind of guidance in which only vulnerable people are encouraged um, to do what they feel is appropriate, and have them be informed, um, while at the same time facilitating an actual resolution and an actual sort of responsible public health response in which you gain herd immunity faster and such. And then and Piers Morgan is just the kind of person who, I mean, I think I might have heard him say this. So I don't want to put words in his mouth, but this is the kind of sensationalism that will say things like, "Well, we don't know if antibodies confer immunity," and stuff like that, which is just utter garbage. Um, that is literally harvested narrative that these sorts of uh, hacks, media hacks, and journalist hacks, are uh, it's not serious stuff. And this kind of abuse of science as well is very reminiscent of sort of the kind of Nazi culture. And well, I mean, we live in a horrible time in which authority from credentials are sort of transmutated into um, a kind of a cultural baton to empower, demagogic, vague, and and usurpations of what I would consider to be a democratic culture and a democratic ethos. That democracy has effectively um, been neutered, and I think institutionally we have to recognize that the proximate villain in our culture is journalism, is the media. That their lack of moral fortitude and sophistication, and their lack of moral integrity, um, and their lack of being able to sort of wade into matters with a care in treating the substance of issues, um, in order to facilitate whatever sort of emotional sticks they have, or which usually are associated with these group uh, kind of a drama over field marshalling, sort of blocks of cultural influence, and that sort of identifying yourself as a sort of as an influencer or as a thought leader is the kind of, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to make a culminating point as is that it seems very much focused on sort of wielding power, and it is a form of unaccountable power, which is which does disgust me. It is something that I, when I see it um, in front. I mean, this is why I make the kind of I didn't focus on it, but this is why I make the comments that I make about Joe Rogan. Even is because I think that this general facet of our culture is the scariest part of our culture. That that sort of the zeitgeist just becomes a kind of a runaway train. That it becomes a life of its own, and reason and examination and critical thinking never catches up with it. It's just a kind of I think that point, Stephen's point of the interviewer that said to Pierce, that perhaps we should have not been prescriptive from a place of ignorance. We shouldn't just have put the most sensationalist experts in the chair of the media spotlight. I mean, I remember very quickly seeing people who I could only see them on YouTube, essentially, because they weren't in the mainstream media, who very quickly dismissed and rebuked or criticized the quality of the Imperial College study. And I remember these things from very early on in this controversy. That I remember. I think the harshest thing that I saw from someone who was self-proclaimed to trying to be as polite as possible said, "The study will never be peer-reviewed because it won't. It would never hope to make it." And basically, I mean, he was in he was outlining that it was garbage, that it was hot garbage. But somehow that narrative gets somewhat impregnated in people's minds, and it seems to be in Piers Morgan's mind. And I mean, look, I can sympathize when he says that he knows a lot of people whose parents have died from this. I think there are statistical arguments to show that every time there's a flu season, you might want to ask, well, whose parents do you know that have died? Which would, I mean, I imagine that if Pierce is talking about his friends whose parents have died, that's sort of the grandparent age. I you know I really don't see this being that much more statistically significant than a general flu season. This is nothing like the Spanish flu. Um, and I think the numbers relatively bear that out. That when we start actually looking at statistics as in just total deaths, how many people die each year? Look at that number. Can we see a noticeable, significant difference? In America, there won't be a difference. In America, relatively the same number of people that die every year. COVID will not make a difference to that. It will be statistically imperceptible. So I think that we have to somewhat reframe our thinking about this. That this is, to a large extent, a media-driven hysterical enterprise. And it is, I mean, I think it's deplorable. And I think what's even worse is that it could be managed better, and it's not being managed better because of more sensationalist, relatively uninformed people who want to school us on morality, who I believe are kind of taking on that valence of the soapbox moral pulpit because they can't actually deal in the realm of reality to some degree. Um, and I do think that this shines out in Piers Morgan's interview here, because he doesn't actually honestly deal with the questions that are being thrown at him. He obfuscates, he diverts, he strawmans, and yeah, I mean, I wonder if there might be other explanations for this. I mean, this might sound like a conspiracy theory, but I'm very sympathetic to Boris Johnson, because I can imagine that if on the substance the British government took a very different tact, if they took a very different line, politics might have been very, very uncomfortable for them, because then they would have had the left complaining like only the left can about, kind of sensational, sort of scapegoating, and because then every death that occurred would have been because of the government if the government didn't take a harsh line. And so I can almost see that because of the state that culture is in, and because of the state that politics is in, and because of the kind of the strange moral hyperbole and the moral panic which culture is prone to because of identity politics, I think identity politics has radicalized much of journalism in general. And so through that lens, through that hostile lens, which is very hostile to a kind of uh, to any kind of power that doesn't infantilize people, that doesn't sort of take on people's burdens for them, that doesn't take on a kind of paternalistic sort of, it is, sadly, culture does have that somewhat political edge to it. I mean, that's also how identity politics, eventually destroys democracy essentially, and destroys the values. And but anyway, under this current climate, I mean, I can be very sympathetic that I can imagine that if Boris Johnson had done everything right, they would have been castrated by the media, that they would have been vilified by the media, and they would have been um, blamed by everything by the opposition. And it would have been very hard to hold that line under the kind of superficial journalism that exists. It would have been very hard to defend against that. It would have put them on the back foot. And so by kind of leaning into sort of a kind of, in a almost, I mean, look, this is a speculation, this is a conspiracy theory to some degree, that in a kind of 4D chess maneuver, Boris Johnson uh, uh, takes the takes a very sort of over uh, overbearing sort of reaction to all of this, to look like that there is no bit of evidence, there's no bit of that he's not, that there's no call to be heeded that he isn't uh, acting on. So he's doing everything that even a whiff of a suggestion would sort of impel him to act more sternly, that he's being over responsive in some sense and not under responsive, so as to at least cover that flank of attack from his cultural and political enemies. I can be very sympathetic to that, and to some degree, I mean, maybe Piers Morgan is, I mean, Piers Morgan criticizing that the government should even do more is to some degree giving Boris Johnson the cover that, well, I'm not going as far as even some other people would have us. Um, so he's having to compromise, and he's having to kind of toe a line which is still delusional, which is still sort of fantastic, but which is, let's say, politically astute. And that's very sad. And I think that the reason why things are so distorted is because of primarily the kind of the radicalization and the kind of the hyperrealism that the media is prone to because of essentially being radicalized by sort of, it wants to feed the appetites of the audience, because the audience is sort of this kind of this irresponsible, amorphous, sort of needy identity, uh, that power must be conducive to the cause of the identity, which basically amounts to a kind of expectation and entitlement to a form of not only sort of infantilism on a practical level, but on a kind of on a weirdly sort of spiritual level, in which that their fears and their subjective feelings are being um, immediately responded to by a kind of certainty and a kind of and a kind of assurance, and also the assurance and the belief that any sensitivity will be amplified and broadcasted by journalism. That essentially the function of journalism is to be the megaphone of any sort of complaint, is to heighten a sense of sensitivity and vulnerability, and to indulge in a sense of vulnerability, instead of acquiring any kind of grasp of reality or understanding of the world, is is second fiddle to actually knowing things, or knowing what the or obviously in issues that are complicated and which are controversial, of um, knowing the probable or likely, sort of or knowing, the sort of the various models of the best um, I mean, maybe this is why these issues are so badly dealt with, because I can't even describe it that well. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that, especially in the context of science, there is never any certainty, but I mean, you can talk about confidence, but I mean, I guess perhaps it's not just journalism. Perhaps it's that science has lent itself towards a kind of, as being the new clerical function in society, the new priestly class, that scientific authority is used to kind of obscure sort of unaccountable political power and such, or unaccountable cultural power. And journalism has made a kind of a kind of a dark pact in surveying and interpreting scientific suggestions. You see this game of headlines of papers that are broadcast in journalism, and the kind of, but the quality and the substance in those papers are never accurately or responsibly communicated or put into any kind of context of understanding. It's always just this technical extraction of some sort of sensationalist edge, which is like, it's just, it reverses itself every week in some sense, that it's just it sort of, it turns the whole thing into a joke, because you're trying to extract a certainty from something that is never a certainty. um, but you can talk about, the models of the leading best fit, kind of understandings in the field, or the kind of the schools of consensus, and the controversies between those general nodes of consensus within a field. um, what is weird, though, is how the minority view has kind of won out in the COVID thing. Uh, and sadly, it's also been because some epidemiologists or some people who have made themselves experts in this area, they don't have backgrounds in mathematics and sort of certain kinds of modeling. Um, and I mean, I just say this because I mean I've spent a lot of time listening to who I consider to be on the right side of this issue, the real experts, the leading professor in Stanford, Professor Leonidas, and you know, he uh, who also published papers on this, sort of refuting all the numbers in the media, um, and doing the studies that would have completely debunked the narrative if anyone ever put a spotlight onto his published papers, but also, uh, I mean, he basically described how, uh, the what was being reported on in the media and the actual scientific evidence behind it didn't even match up. Um, and he talked about what what is already known about this family of viruses, um, and so what we can expect from the knowledge that we already have about viruses like this. And I mean, obviously, there's a very small likelihood that some viruses have more variability in their families than others, but we actually know quite a lot about COVID viruses, um, and so the kind of the play on a kind of on a kind of pure technical skepticism, oh, well, we don't know that in this case antibodies confer immunity. That is an irresponsible statement to make in public. If you, I mean, that's literally fear mongering. In the context of a COVID virus, that is fear mongering. That is unscientific, essentially. Um, I mean, you might as well not say that specifically. You might as well say uh, we should expect that antibodies will confer immunity, but obviously nothing is certain until we, there, or rather, there is an element of uncertainty, but we can expect that, and we're working on ascertaining that, and then things, and then we have now a lot of evidence. I mean, there's no contrary evidence that antibodies do not confer immunity. There was supposedly a paper, or there was supposedly a case around China. It's not true. There was supposedly some evidence out of China that someone was reinfected. Not true. There is no evidence that that was actually a reinfection, but that was extracted into this media narrative, essentially, and it's disgusting. I mean, this is essentially an abuse of science. Um, but I mean, specifically the suppression of the real experts, I think, is the real travesty. Um, and I do think that you can't blame Boris Johnson for suppressing these experts. This is journalism's fault. And I think that if journalism was in a different state, then culture would be in a different state, and then the government would have a different kind of pressure that it could uh, cope with in taking a more proactive line. But I mean, I personally find it disgusting that essentially politics is held hostage to this, um, and I do think there is some blame to be put on personalities like Piers Morgan. But I mean, I guess I'm making a general critique. I'm not just making a personal critique. I mean, because in some sense, Piers Morgan can't be blamed. I mean, in some sense, this is a broader commentary. When I say that Piers Morgan can't be blamed, let me finish that thought. I mean in the context that Piers Morgan doesn't put Piers Morgan on television. Somebody else puts Piers Morgan on television. Someone else makes that decision. Uh, and I think that Piers Morgan perhaps is more. It's not as if he doesn't fulfill any function. I mean, I think he does on purely cultural matters. I think someone like him is needed because in cultural matches in cultural matters you're dealing with perhaps a more nebulous subject matter. You're not dealing with something that is so exact. You're dealing in sort of opinions. Um, and I certainly don't agree with all of Piers Morgan's opinions, and it's fine to have a difference of opinion, and it's fine to explore them. Um, and I mean, I think that Piers Morgan has been very successful at shedding light on very tricky, complicated issues around at least identity politics. That uh, he's by no means a villain in the state of journalism, I guess. So I mean, I don't mean to sort of but he's a news person more on the cultural side of things, more on the social side of things, or at least that's how I see him. I guess when I'm talking about the state of journalism, I mean is when anchormen are taking on the kind of the way that Piers Morgan deals with cultural issues, and they're applying that to politics, and they're applying that to. And I guess Piers Morgan is more of a personality where he has his own very, he brings his views to the interviews. Um, so he's not sort of doing clean cut journalism. He's doing sort of opinion journalism, perhaps. Um, so I mean, there are certain qualifications in terms of what he is doing, but I do think, well, reasoning, and uh, sort of fidelity to underlying substance is a filter against the the integrity of one's opinions. And I think at some point one's opinions do start to become sort of dishonored if one does not make them susceptible to invigilation and direct engagement. And so, when I see someone who is somewhat jealously guarding and protecting their their fragile opinions with a kind of moral sanctimoniousness, it is off-putting. Especially when that's also backed up by a whole lot of sort of wishful thinking and sort of seeing yourself as part of some moral majority, which I sort of went into that one example when he was, um, I believe, interviewing a Polish European parliamentarian, EU parliamentarian. Anyway, let me end this recording.